The Writers Guild of America is on strike, or at least that's still the state of affairs as of this writing, which I'm totally allowed to do since I'm not a guild member and I'm not working for any of the struck companies. I'd never cross a picket line. I'm not a scab. The writer's strike has brought much of the American TV and movie industry to a standstill, and in the next few months, things could get even worse, with potential strikes from the actors and directors guilds also possible this summer. With one of the most massive work stoppages in the history of the entertainment industry looming, it sure seems like it would be in everyone's best interests for the studios to just cut the bullshit and agree to pay a fair share to the artists who create the products that generate the revenue that makes their way of life possible. But that would be the intelligent, humane, and reasonable thing to do, and when have studio executives ever been any of those? As a rule, I mean, I'm sure it's happened once or twice over the last 100 years. Anyway, if that doesn't happen and the strike and or strikes drag on and on and on, don't you worry about not having anything to watch, because there is one form of entertainment that is utterly invulnerable to work stoppages. One business that is, dare I say it, strike-proof. That business, professional wrestling, also known as pro wrestling, or, if you're being charged by the letter, simply wrestling. And the reason why pro wrestling is immune from strikes is that the pro wrestling business does not have, and has never had, a union. No union for the wrestlers, no union for the agents or producers, as they're called today, in the big-time companies who help the wrestlers put together their matches. No union for the writers who craft the storylines in which the wrestlers participate. No unions in the wrestling business. Which is pretty nuts, if you think about it. Pro wrestling itself is difficult to categorize. It's sometimes described as combat theater, a hybrid of drama and athletics. Wrestlers are professional athletes, sort of. Baseball players have a union, so do football players, and basketball players, and hockey players. Not wrestlers. Wrestlers are also actors, sort of, plus a lot of what they do essentially amounts to stunt work. Actors and stunt performers have a union, not wrestlers. And like I said, there are writers in the wrestling business. WWE, the largest pro wrestling company in the world, employs a writing staff of more than 24 people who contribute to the shows the company produces. Writers who work for movie and TV studios have a union. Not writers who work for WWE. Why don't wrestlers and other people who work in the wrestling business have a union? The answer to that question is simple and straightforward, but also incredibly complicated, much like wrestling itself. The simple version is that Hulk Hogan is a stool pigeon. Jesse Ventura tried to organize the WWF, now WWE, locker room in 1986, but Hogan found out about it and ratted to WWF owner Vince McMahon, who squashed the union before it could even get started. Ventura's sabotaged attempt to start a union is the most well-known such effort in wrestling history, but it wasn't the first. Pro football player turned pro wrestler Jim Wilson tried to start a union for wrestlers in the 1970s. And got himself blackballed by the NWA, the Association of Regional Wrestling Promoters, that was the most powerful organization in the business in the decades prior to the WWF's national expansion. Wilson spent the next few decades fighting against the unfair labor practices of wrestling promoters, taking his case to the media as well as the courts without much success. As the violent history of the labor movement shows us, it is not easy to start a union in an industry that's hostile to organized labor, and the pro wrestling business definitely qualifies. For much of its history, pro wrestling was an extremely guarded business. It was highly territorial, both in the sense that it consisted of small companies that operated in specific geographical territories, and in the sense that people who worked in the business went to often absurd lengths to keep outsiders from learning how it operated. Because of this, the pro wrestling business, at least as it existed until around 25 years ago, has sometimes been compared to the mafia or a secret society. The primary reason for this was to carry on the pretense that wrestling was what it pretended to be, a legitimate competitive sport. Even though the true nature of pro wrestling has been an open secret since at least the 1930s, promoters feared it would destroy their business if the truth were to become widely known to the public. Accordingly, it was standard practice until relatively recently for wrestlers to refuse to publicly admit it and to be ready to respond to the charge that wrestling was fake with violence. Ask John Stossel about that. Just be sure to speak into his good ear. Because it was so protected, actually, can I see that clip of John Stossel getting the shit smacked out of him again?
I think this is fake.
You think it's fake?
Yeah!
What's that? Is that fake? Huh? What the hell's wrong with you? That's open hand slap, huh? You think it's fake?
Have another one, you smug libertarian dork. Because it was so protected, promoters, the bosses of the wrestling business, had a lot of power. While some states did compel wrestling promotions to comply with the standards set forth by the Athletic Commission, those requirements mostly applied to what happened at wrestling shows, in front of the fans. Behind the curtain, the business was essentially unregulated. Wrestling promoters could conduct their affairs more or less as they pleased because nobody was watching. This meant the promoters could treat their wrestlers as they saw fit and pay them whatever they felt like paying them, and there was little the wrestlers could do about it. They could always quit, but a wrestler who left one promotion on bad terms would have a hard time finding a spot somewhere else. There was the occasional nod in the direction of fairness and transparency, but even then, things were only as fair or transparent as the promoter of the territory wanted them to be. A promoter might agree to pay wrestlers a fixed percentage of ticket sales based on where they were used on the card. Wrestlers in main events or featured matches made more, wrestlers on the undercard made less, but there was no way of knowing how much the promoter skimmed off the top for himself before paying the wrestlers their shares. The wrestlers brought in the crowds, but it was always the promoters who were in control. Of course, things were a little different for the most successful wrestlers. If a wrestler was a headliner, he had a lot more leverage, because it would hurt the promoter a lot more to lose him. And sometimes, if a wrestler made enough money, he was able to become a promoter himself. Some of the most successful promoters from the territorial era, which lasted from the 1940s through the 1980s, started out as wrestlers. But that hierarchy, with promoters at the top and wrestlers at the bottom, was baked into the business early on and remains in place to this day. For most of wrestling history, wrestlers worked on verbal contracts and handshake deals. In the modern era, for those lucky enough to get hired by a major wrestling company, there are guaranteed contracts, which provide some protection, especially for wrestlers who are big enough stars to negotiate for more favorable terms. But even wrestlers who are signed to lucrative guaranteed deals still have to contend with the longest standing and most egregious abusive labor practice in the industry, which is basically universal. Pro wrestlers are considered by pro wrestling companies to be independent contractors. Even wrestlers who sign guaranteed contracts that lock them into the service of one company and give that company the power to dictate everything from what that wrestler does on the show, to their schedule, to their dress code, are considered independent contractors rather than company employees. This allows wrestling companies to avoid having to provide wrestlers with certain benefits that are legally required for employees, including health insurance. Now, back in the day, when wrestling companies were smaller, written contracts were rare, and it was commonplace for wrestlers to move from territory to territory and work for multiple promoters, maybe the independent contractor model made sense. Hell, for certain wrestling companies today that only run a few shows a month and legitimately couldn't afford to treat every wrestler they book as a full employee, maybe it still makes sense. But WWE? They reported $1.3 billion in gross revenue and nearly $200 million in net income last year alone. A company that successful, with its success built on the blood, sweat, tears, and broken bodies of wrestlers, still refuses to treat those wrestlers as employees and insists on calling them independent contractors instead? Ain't that a... I was going to say kick in the head, but that works. Unless we have video of Stossel getting kicked in the head. No. The thing is, though, as much as I love that clip, the same thing that led to John Stossel getting his conservative crackpot cranium crushed is also what has stood in the way of the unionization of the wrestling business. Tradition. Dr. D. David Schultz went upside John Stossel's head because Stossel called wrestling fake, and back then, when an outsider said wrestling was fake to a wrestler, that's what happened. It's just the way things were done. And today, if a wrestler or a wrestling promoter gets asked about why there isn't a union, they're likely as not to answer with the same thing. Wrestling doesn't need a union. Wrestlers don't want a union. The status quo is good for everybody. It's just the way things are done. That non-union status quo is so deeply ingrained in the culture of pro wrestling that even people in the business who have spoken out strongly in favor of the rights of wrestlers and done things to raise the standard of compensation and overall treatment of wrestlers almost always pull up short when it comes to the question of unionization. Cody Rhodes, my favorite wrestler for the last several years, left WWE in 2016 after being a mid-card staple there for 10 years. He reinvented himself on the independent scene, became a top star in Ring of Honor and New Japan, and in September of 2018, co-promoted All In, one of the most successful independent shows in the history of the wrestling industry. The first show not promoted by a major wrestling company to sell 10,000 tickets since 1993. Then, in January 2019, Cody became one of the original top stars and executives at All Elite Wrestling, a brand new company that promised to set itself apart by being a wrestling promotion run by wrestlers. Cody, along with the Young Bucks, Nick and Matt Jackson, and Kenny Omega, would not only wrestle for AEW, they would take a hand in the operation of AEW as executive vice presidents. So naturally, when journalists talked to Cody about his brand new wrestling company with its wrestlers first philosophy, the subject eventually came around to a wrestlers union. And in an interview with Sports Illustrated from January of 2019, he said this: "A union in pro wrestling would put pro wrestling out of business." Cody later clarified on Twitter that he was specifically referring to the independent wrestling business, and that unions are good, actually. But if that's how Cody feels, why doesn't AEW, the company at which he was a top executive for 3 years before leaving to return to the WWE in 2022, have a union? Its footprint isn't nearly as big as that of WWE, but it is WWE's nearest competitor and is owned by a family of billionaires, the Khan family, which also owns the NFL's Jacksonville Jaguars, and it produces several hours of live weekly TV on TBS and TNT, plus a half dozen or so annual live pay-per-view events. It hardly qualifies as an indie promotion, is my point. And it was founded by wrestlers who have all claimed to want to make the business better for wrestlers who are or have been top executives in the company. So, maybe unions would be damaging to the independent wrestling scene. I kind of doubt that, but maybe, let's say they would, for the sake of argument. Would a wrestlers union put AEW out of business? It's owned by billionaires, has a TV deal with Warner Brothers Discovery worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and as of this writing, is rumored to be about to announce a new TV deal with WBD that could be worth substantially more than that. A wrestlers union would put that out of business? WWE, $1.3 billion gross, $200 million net last year alone. A wrestlers union would put that out of business? I'm not privy to the inner financial workings of these companies, but it sure doesn't look like that to me. What it looks like to me is the same line of horseshit we get from every other company when workers are trying to organize. Amazon, Walmart, take your pick. We can't afford it. It would put us out of business. Never mind the fact that the union doesn't even exist yet. They have no idea what its demands would be if it did exist, and following those demands would come a negotiation where both sides would have to compromise before reaching an agreement that would give the union some of what it wanted and would not put the company out of business, because if the company goes out of business, then everyone loses their jobs, and that kind of defeats the whole point of the union, doesn't it? Also, never mind the fact that companies always pitch unrealistic worst-case scenarios when describing the impact meeting union demands would have on their bottom line. Earlier this month, the Writers Guild estimated that if the studios were to accept all of their proposals for a new collective bargaining agreement as is, it would cost each of the major studios a tiny fraction of their annual revenue. And I mean tiny. It would cost Disney 0.09% of what they made last year. For Netflix, it would be a little more expensive at 0.2%. A hypothetical wrestlers union would probably cost WWE and AEW more than that, seeing as how that collective bargaining agreement would be the first one in the history of the industry, and there are quite a few long-standing inequities that it would need to address, but something tells me they could still easily afford it. Not that it makes a difference to the owners. Just like the owners of major sports franchises, the owners of wrestling companies will pay their athletes as little as they can get away with paying them. Wrestling promoters are also well practiced in the art of talking out of both sides of their mouths to evade arguments for unionization. Vince McMahon is the master of this. When it suits his interests to treat WWE's product like a sport, he'll do that. Coverage by mainstream outlets like ESPN and Sports Illustrated is always appreciated, but suggest that wrestlers should have their equivalent of a players' association, and he or one of his spokespeople will quickly point out that actually that wouldn't be appropriate because what WWE wrestlers do is not actually a sport. On the other hand, Vince loves to talk about WWE's programming as though it's a form of scripted entertainment, a weekly action-adventure series, and that its flagship show, Monday Night Raw, which has been on since 1993, deserves to be spoken of in the same breath as other long-running TV institutions like Gunsmoke, The Simpsons, and the Law & Order franchise. That line only lasts until someone points out that scripted dramas and comedies like those are all produced by union shops, that their actors, writers, directors, and crew are all union members. Then it becomes, well, actually what we do isn't the same. WWE is unique, and you can't really put it in a box like that and expect that arrangements which might make sense for those shows would also make sense for us. The truth is, there won't be a wrestlers' union until enough wrestlers want one and are willing to stand up and say so. And that has to include the top stars, because wrestling always has been and likely always will be a top-down business, in the ring as much as in the locker room and in the office. If there's ever to be a wrestlers' union, the top draws, the main event talent, the ones who get their faces on the posters, will have to be among those demanding it. If people like Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar and Chris Jericho and CM Punk and Cody Rhodes don't call for it, it's never going to happen. Which brings me back to Jesse Ventura and Hulk Hogan. A few weeks before WrestleMania 2, in April of 1986, Jesse Ventura, who had mostly retired from the ring and was mainly an announcer by this point, went to the locker room and urged his fellow wrestlers to seize the rare opportunity they had. The matches for WrestleMania had all been announced. The marketing was locked in. It was the biggest show the WWF had ever put on, and because of that, they, the wrestlers, had all the leverage. If they refused to work WrestleMania until they were allowed to unionize, Vince McMahon would have no choice but to agree. Ventura had recently joined the Screen Actors Guild after being cast in a supporting role in the film Predator, and reasoned that wrestlers, being television stars, ought to join as well. As Ventura tells the story, the day after his locker room pitch, he received a phone call from an irate McMahon who threatened to fire him if he ever tried to unionize the roster again. Ventura, angry that someone in the locker room had obviously ratted him out to Vince, agreed to drop his union push, declaring that if his fellow wrestlers were too stupid to fight for their rights, he wasn't going to fight for them either. Years later, while being deposed as part of a lawsuit, Vince McMahon was asked how he had learned of Ventura's attempt to start a union. McMahon answered that Hulk Hogan had told him about it. Hogan, the top star in the wrestling business, was apparently worried that a union would lead to the wrestlers' share of the revenue being more evenly distributed, which might mean a larger cut for the wrestlers in general, but a smaller cut for Hogan personally. And that didn't work for him, brother. So yeah, short answer, Hulk Hogan is a stool pigeon. Longer answer, the motivation that turned Hogan into a stool pigeon is something that's been ingrained in the wrestling business from the very beginning. You're a wrestler. You're not an employee. You're an independent contractor. You need to look after yourself because nobody else will. The boss will use you as long as you put money in his pocket and not a second longer, and he'll screw you over if you let him. Might not be fair, but hey, that's the wrestling business, kid. I mentioned CM Punk a couple of minutes ago, another of my favorite wrestlers. He's spoken out in favor of wrestlers unionizing in the past, but he's also been very pessimistic about it actually happening, mainly because he believes solidarity among wrestlers is an illusion. I've never worked in the wrestling business, so I can't say whether he's right or wrong, but there certainly doesn't seem to be much solidarity among wrestlers when money is on the table. Combine that get yours before the other guy does attitude with the independent contractor model and the rest of the deeply rooted cultural stuff I've talked about, plus the way wrestlers of the current generation, particularly those who work for WWE, are conditioned to just be happy to be there. And it doesn't look like a wrestlers union is something we should expect to see anytime soon. If I was a union organizer, I'd focus my efforts on another industry, one that wouldn't put up so much resistance, that would be less of a challenge. Maybe strip clubs. And hey, if you spend enough time in titty bars, you'll meet lots of wrestlers anyway, so who knows?